Hotep, everybody. This is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network and host of the African History Network show. It is Sunday, March 31st, 2024. It's Resurrection Sunday for some of you, but we're still here with our brother, Professor Manu Ampim. Hotep, brother, how you doing today?
Hotep, brother Michael. I'm holding it down here on the West Coast, my brother.
All right. He's on the West Coast, and we have a fantastic discussion plan for today. We were originally going to do this interview back in February of 2024, but we weren't able to do it, so we rescheduled it for today. We're going to talk about Professor Manu Ampim's new book, Volume 2 of A History of African Civilizations. He has a special section in there dealing with the great Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who's known as the father of Black History, father of Black History Month, but there's not a lot of information really about Dr. Woodson and his research on African history and African culture. Professor Manu Ampim is going to talk about that today, as well as a topic that Professor Manu Ampim talks about all the time, which is the need for primary research. The need for primary research, okay? Now, if you're not familiar with Professor Manu Ampim, he's a historian and primary or firsthand researcher specializing in African and African-American history and culture. He's currently a tenured professor of History and Africana Studies and the chair of the History, Anthropology, and Geography Department at Contra Costa College in San Pablo, California. He is also the director of Advancing the Research, which is in Oakland, California, Advancing the Research, where he created a 7-step primary research methodology home training course. He has a Master's of Arts degree in history and African-American Studies from Morgan State University. His master's thesis, which we've interviewed him about before here on the African History Network show, is The Revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr. in 1989, and it's being expanded into a 2-volume work entitled Martin Luther King, The Evolution of a Revolutionary. Martin Luther King, The Evolution of a Revolutionary. And I know when I've talked to you in the past, Professor Manu, you talk about how Dr. King is very much misunderstood, very much underrated, etc. So we definitely need that book. So when we talk about why don't you give us a synopsis of your book first? Let's start there. Why don't you give us a synopsis, a history of African civilization?
Well, yeah,
African civilizations.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, you know, the book actually is the second revised edition, and the History of African Civilizations actually grew out of my work at Contra Costa College, where I teach a class on African civilizations. It's a unique class because we deal with Africa at the apex of human achievement without dealing with the derailment of slavery, colonialism. We don't focus on that. And what I was doing is sharing with my students all of my firsthand research and articles, essays, slides, but that's not user-friendly. So I created a reader, but I said, why create a reader for the class and not make it also available for the public? So the book grew out of my work on campus, and I wanted to make sure that I could spread what I'm teaching in the classroom as wide as possible to the public. So it's based on my 35 years of doing work in dozens of countries on African civilizations, but I wanted to also make sure it was available to the public. So it actually is a text book, but it also is a book for the community, and people can even use it as a layperson because there's actually some lesson plans and resources at the end of each chapter. So the book grew out of that, and it's just a small part of what I teach, but it's what I teach nevertheless as we go and look at Africa from an inside perspective. And one of the great things, Brother Michael, that I've been focusing on is to make sure that I can attack and overturn the widespread information viruses that are out there. People know about computer viruses, they know about coronavirus, but there's information viruses, there's widespread misinformation that takes place. So my career has been to tackle and challenge this misinformation by doing the first-hand original research and making sure that people are not talking about, as they say these days, back in the day. Well, whose day? What day? Professors don't think that way. So we challenge this back in the day idea because nobody's held accountable. It's just, you know, back in Africa, they used to do this. That's not good enough. So I bring not only the information, but the teaching and research methodology when we go to the sites and sources. So that's what the book attempts to do, and I think we've achieved, making that information and the methodology available to the community.
Okay, now I know you're big on primary research. I know you teach a class on that as well. You have it at your website, advancingtheresearch.org. Years ago, when I first interviewed you on my Blog Talk Radio show, you talked about the need for primary research. So explain for people who may not know, who may not really, study history like we do. We dedicate our lives to this type of work. Explain to people exactly what primary research is and how does that compare to secondary research or tertiary research?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Primary research basically means firsthand research. It means when you're going directly to the sources and to the sites, or going to the original information and evidence as opposed to going through someone else. So primary means firsthand research. And so that's what I decided to do, so I can have a clear understanding by going to pyramids, temples, tombs, ancient residential sites, and living communities, as well as museums, institutes, and libraries, going to look at the original artifacts and documents. That's what primary research is about. Whereas secondary is that if I am doing the work out in the field and then share it with someone else, then if they're relaying it to other folks, then they would become a secondhand source. If I give a presentation or lecture or seminar, then those that receive it now are one level removed from the original information. So it's called secondary. And when that person leaves a seminar or lecture and then shares it with their family or community, then those receiving it in the community now are a third-hand source of information, or what we call tertiary information. And the further information gets away from the source, the more inaccurate it is, because people are creative. You can be as clear and simple as possible, but when it gets away from the source, the more the information is inaccurate and distorted. So we can't always do all of the first-hand research. So there is a great need for secondhand information, or people who are out in the field sharing information as widely as possible in their networks. But a real scholar is not just relying on that, on what other people have written or what other people have produced, but they're going to the sources themselves as well. So this is why primary research is the highest level of research, and we can't minimize the significance of it, because one thing I learned by looking at the actual documents and going out in the field myself, it's like, wow, what I had been told versus what I saw and was able to document is usually very, very different. So this is why primary research is important. And, and people always talk about his story.
Right.
I agree. There's a concern about him or his story. So we've always called it our story, but we cannot teach and promote our story accurately unless we're going to the records and the sources. And it's not easy, but it's required. It's required if we're going to penetrate another level of understanding and learning. So that's why I'm so totally dedicated to primary research.
Right, and it's time consuming, and it costs money too. It costs money to do research as well. People think it's just free to do all this type, but no, it's not. And we don't do this for the money, but it sure as hell takes money to do this.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
In the beginning, you mentioned misinformation that's out there, and I think you talked about a history virus or something about a virus. What'd you call it?
Information virus.
Information virus, right? Information virus. So so let people know when people take your class at Contra Costa College, are you teaching freshmen, sophomore, juniors? Are you teaching master's courses? Who, generally speaking, what level are you teaching?
Contra Costa College is it's a community college. So we have a lot of younger students out of high school, 18 to 22, 25, but there's a lot of returning students in their 30s, 40s.
Yeah.
It's pretty common to have grandparents as well. And when people know that I'm teaching the African civilizations class, I get community people that will sign up for that course. So they may not be a large percentage, but there's always older community people just taking that one class. And then we also, as I mentioned, we have older people as well. But if you look at the largest group, it would be a group in their teens, 20s, and early 30s. That's the larger group. And by the way, it's a cross section of students. Now,
Right.
I get more students of African descent in my African civilizations class than we would in the U.S. history class and the California history class. But it's a range of students. And, you know, and one of the things, too, about if you're effective, and students are not just in the class to get a grade, that means that after the semester, when the grades are turned in and there's no incentive for them to be in touch with you, and when students come back and then they find me on social media, they're not even history majors, they're not even African American studies majors, they just want to continue to learn. And so that's when you know you're effective, because they can say anything during the semester, but after the semester, matter of fact, just this past week, one of my former students, he's now a football coach, and I was doing a talk on campus, and he said that, Professor, I just want you to know that I took your class around 2008. You know, by that time, you know, bodies change and facial hair and all that. So I didn't recognize it. I didn't recognize him at first, and then he gave me his name. I said, I remember that name, and then he sent me an old picture. I said, I remember. And so Brian, he said that it's because he took my classes that he decided to major in history, and that's been his discipline ever since. But that's what I get on a regular basis. And so you can, you know, we're not in it for accolades. We're definitely not in it for the money or anything like that. But it always is refreshing when we see students in the community and they tell us different stories about the impact. So that's how I know that it's impacting not only students of African descent, but students across the board, because if you're giving insight from a balanced perspective, reasonable people see the value in it. And that's what I've learned over the 18 years that I've been at Contra Costa. 18? Let's see how many years. Yeah, been 18 now.
Right. Well, and I asked that question because I wanted to ask this follow-up question. You know, I interviewed Dr. Darrell Scott, who he was a history professor at Howard University. He's now at Morgan State University. He's a friend of mine. And he actually is the former past president of ASALH, Association for the Study of African American Life and History. So, you know Dr. Darrell Scott?
I definitely do.
Okay. So I interviewed him, and he was talking about how the freshmen who come to his history class, he has to dispel all these myths that they've gotten about history and bad history from YouTube and different things like this, right? And in a lot of my lectures, I talk about how sometimes I have to spend the first 20 minutes dispelling myths before I can really get into the subject matter, especially if we talk about, you know, Dr. King, the Civil Rights Movement, Malcolm X, different things like this. So I was just wondering, what are some of the popular myths that students come to your class with that you have to dispel? A lot of times you got to get past these myths before you can even get into the syllabus, before you can get to the real subject matter.
Yeah, that's a great question. One would be to challenge this, as I mentioned before, this idea that back in the day is a relevant response. It's not a relevant response. People use that because they don't have the details. So I have to tell them that in a professional setting, historical context means everything. So you have to always answer the questions of when and where, and not talk about back in the day. Whose day? What do you mean? That's too general. So that's one thing. And then there's other things, like in the U.S. history class, I'll start there. There's all kinds of myths, so such as Lincoln, quote unquote, freed the slaves. So I blow that away. And students are shocked. They're shocked when we go to the text and the actual sources of what Lincoln wrote and what he said in his speeches, that he had no respect for equality for Black people or anything else. So that's a huge myth that's overturned. And also a big myth is that Black people or people of African descent first came to the U.S. as enslaved victims. But when I show that they came as masters of their own fate, as rulers, as great traders, and great people of high stature and influence, they're blown away by that because they've never heard it, never seen it, and never thought about it. And I think another one that stands out is the criminality of Columbus. And that it wasn't until 1992 that he went from being celebrated to now he's been condemned as a common criminal because of his own writings and his own conduct. Those are some things that are shocking. And if I look at the African Civilizations course, a big takeaway or big influence that people have, they have no idea of the high level classical African civilizations. They're not aware of ancient Kush. They might have heard about a Nubian king or Nubian queen in the popular discussion. You know, people just make that statement. When I show them that that's not just some statement, here are Nubian people, here are Nubian children, Nubian school, Nubian elders, here's Nubian contributions to humanity. There, and I think one other thing in addition to that is the fact that Kemet or Egypt is thoroughly and fundamentally African, and it is always been and continues to be a part of Africa, both historically, geographically, linguistically, culturally. So those are some of the things that come out and stand out on a regular and consistent basis throughout all of my classes.
Now, so I want to hit on this, then I want you to talk about Kush. So when you talk about Africans came to this land that we call the United States of America, and I make a difference between the land we call the United States of America and the Americas. I'm not talking about South America. You know, we know about Abubakar II in 1312 AD, things like that. But you mentioned specifically the land we call the United States of America. Africans first came here as rulers, not as slaves, conquered and shackled by Europeans. Talk about what period of time you're talking about, and give us some examples of what you mean by this.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I covered this also in my book as well. The book is a survey of these African civilizations. Well, the first period in dealing with the Americas of the Western Hemisphere, I start there. Okay. And it's to deal with a undeniable African presence and influence among the Olmec. Now, all the Olmec were not African if people look at the images, but to try to deny that Africans were there is folly and has nothing to do with definitive evidence. So the first episode is to look at Africans a little over 3,000 years ago, about 1200 before the Common Era, and to show that Olmec rulers, there's been 17 heads that have been found thus far since the late 1850s. So I show the heads, and we look at the context of the features, because the features of those massive heads that are, some are 5 tons, 10 tons, 20 tons, 30-ton heads. You can look at the Africoid appearance. So part of it is, so that's one episode, but it's not just the images. It's to look at the hieroglyphic writing system and the rituals and ceremonies among the Olmec and see similarities, as well as the architecture with Africa and see similarities. And I remember talking with the late great Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, and he's, you know, he had pointed out that if there's contact and influence, it won't just be in one area. There'll be numerous areas, and that's one of the things that I share with students. That number one, we look at the Olmec influence, and then I share all of these particular details about the Olmec. But then another area is one you actually mentioned, because we don't have time to go into all the details in the class. But I do share with them that there are many episodes when Africans came to the Americas. So I even showed them and showed that Abubakar II in 1312, because people remember like rhymes. I remember that when I was growing up, we never forgot when Columbus didn't discover, but when he came to the Americas, they would always teach us that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in the Nina, the Pinta, and Santa Maria. So I never forgot 1492. So I always tell students, if that works, then let's do it for Abubakar II. That in 1312, Abubakar II sailed the ocean blue. I say, so I tell them, you know, to put that in your pipe to smoke it. So, but Abubakar came about 180 years before Columbus. The difference is he did not keep a journal. So then somebody would say, well, how do we know that the 2,000 ships actually made it? Well, we have to look at the currents and the wind. But we also don't even really have to guess, because the conquistadors themselves, from Balboa to Columbus and a number of people, said they saw Africans when they arrived. Those are the ones that introduced and brought slavery. So that
with gold-tipped spears too.
Absolutely. No question. And matter of fact, in the Darien region of Panama, that's the southernmost area of Panama, Balboa in 1513 clearly said that he saw 2 black men among the native people. So people say, yeah, but they're just descendants of slaves. That makes no sense, because chronologically, Balboa is the first conquistador that brought slavery. But what we learned from the records is that Africans in that region were distinct and separate from Native Americans. It seems as though that they had some differences and conflict. So they had their own areas. And this is what, so the conquistadors are not looking for Africans, they're just describing their experiences. So then the question, well, how would conquistadors or Spanish know the difference between Native Americans and Africans? And so, well, that's pretty easy to discuss, is because the Africans controlled Spain for almost 800 years. They know exactly what Africans were.
About the Moors.
Yes, Moors, absolutely. And no question whatsoever. So Garcia Ordonez de Montalvo, when he writes his novel in 1510 about the Night Esplandian, he explains that it was Queen Khalifa that ruled over the so-called island of California. They didn't know it wasn't an island, it's just a small strip of land. And so, well, where would he get this name Khalifa from? Because the Moors, you know, one of the titles of a Muslim title is the Caliph. And a caliph is a ruler. So to feminize the word in Spanish, you get from caliph, you get califa. And so this is what was in the mind of the Spanish. And so you got an author who writes about this story of a woman controlling so-called California, and the conquistadors, they took that seriously. Like Cortez, he takes that seriously, looking to conquer not only the mighty Aztec and Montezuma II, but also to conquer whoever this Khalifa was. I go into those two areas, the Olmec from 3,000 years ago, and then the West African voyages in the 1300s, and then use the conquistadors who came later and who described the Africans that they saw and heard about from Native Americans, to show two very distinct periods of Africans in the Western Hemisphere before the conquistadors, before Columbus, Balboa, and Pizarro and the rest of them, to show that they came as independent traders and rulers and not slaves initially.
Yeah, and you know, the one book that I recommend for people is by Dr. John Henry Clark, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism, because this book came out in 1992, which was that 500-year commemoration of Columbus setting sail on his voyages. And what a lot of people miss, and this is, I probably first heard Professor Kabahai Wafa Kamene talk about this. He's one of my teachers. Columbus set sail late in the same year that the Moors lose control of their last stronghold, Granada, January 2nd, 1492. So, and when you deal with that 800 years and a good book, and I got it somewhere here in the office, Golden Age of the Moor, edited by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, which you just talked about. That was one of the books right there that caused me to like really hone in on this history and really understand, because a lot of people ask the question, okay, you have ancient Kush, you have, you know, Nubia, you have, you know, Ta-Nehisi, you have ancient Kemet, you have Great Zimbabwe. How do we end up in chains, things like this? Well, you got to look at that 800-year period of those Africans, not just in Spain. They first go into that Iberian Peninsula, but go all throughout Europe. And they're taking the teachings from the Nile Valley region of Africa into Europe, which brings Europe out of the Dark Ages. And I talk about how everything we taught Europeans came back to kick us in the behind. Okay, everything we taught them came back to kick us in the behind, whether it was making swords, whether it was introducing the periodic tables, chemistry, the almanacs, showing them what's around the world, things like this. So talk about for a minute the importance of really understanding this chronology of history, because, you know, one of the problems I had with the 1619 project, even though they do have some good information in there, I wouldn't pass a law to ban it. You know, I wouldn't do that. But one of the things that they do is they do mention 1526 when the Spanish try to set up a settlement in the South Carolina, Georgia area. Right. And they take about 100 Africans in there. That's 93 years before 1619. But they don't like really deal with that chronology before 1619. Okay. Right. Talk about the importance of understanding the African Moors and their connection to the Nile Valley region of Africa.
Well, I think people should know that the Moors were from North Africa. These were Muslims. These were African Muslims from the north, and they were able to bring a tremendous intellectual tradition into the Iberian Peninsula, into Spain and in parts of Portugal in 711 of the Common Era. And the Moors, they don't just develop this in a vacuum. You have a tremendous intellectual tradition that goes back many millennia in the Nile Valley. And then also there's a great intellectual tradition in West Africa too. So that's Van Sertima's book, and that's part of the Journal of African Civilizations, which, by the way, is the greatest journal on African civilizations in the second half of the 20th century, from 1979 to 1994, 15 years of one of the most important series of publications that we've seen. And the golden age of the Moors is part of that. But the Moorish intellectual tradition is very important, because when they go into Europe in 711 and occupy Spain, they don't just go in and destroy; they bring knowledge. They bring book making and the book distribution industry. They introduce universities. They introduce the first streets with lights. They introduce architecture. The Moors also introduced, so people can't even talk about the cultural aspects like the flamingo. You can't talk about the flamingo unless you look at the Moorish influence in music and dance. Now, the Spanish Christians didn't necessarily like being occupied, but the reality is they were occupied by African Muslims, but it wasn't a destructive occupation, even though they may not have been excited about it. But we can see that the Moors had a tremendous influence, and it wasn't to go in and destroy and tear down things. They made very important contributions. And this is what is one of the hallmarks. But they do bring an intellectual tradition. They do help bring science into Europe, because there was a dark age. They didn't know. And it's not an accident that the Moors stayed for over 780 years. And when they were kicked out, as you were alluding to, in 1492, that same year, Columbus set sail in August of that same year. And by the way, Columbus was aware of West Africa because he was a part of the enslaving group. He was aware of West Africa long before 1492. But one thing that Columbus was also aware of, that Africans were traveling west. He didn't know where or how far, but they were traveling west. So he had the idea that and they were called merchants, not just travelers, but merchants, with merchandise traveling west before 1492. So while Europe was unaware, they had no idea about the world, it was the cartography of the Moors that helped introduce them to proper geography about the world. And so Columbus, yes, he was a risk taker. In Europe, they thought the world was probably flat. That's why it was difficult for him to get funding. But Ferdinand and Isabella finally came together, and they pushed the Moors out, but they also financed Columbus's first of his 4 journeys. They figured it was no big loss because they weren't going. They sent him and 3 ships and 90 men, and they figured that, well, if he falls off the side of the earth, then there's not a big loss for us. And but that was very significant, that in 1492 he takes the voyage, and the world has not been the same, not because he discovered anything, but because of his ruthlessness. Correct. It was him who introduced slavery in the Americas. It was Columbus that introduced the slave trade. It was Columbus that introduced the scramble for the Americas. Before that, and then right after he comes and takes 25 Taino back to Spain, victims, to so-called civilize them and to teach them Spanish and to show proof of a so-called successful voyage. Columbus was geographically challenged. The man thought he was in India, so he called the people Indians. He had no idea he was in another part of the world. But the problem is that as soon as he goes back to Spain, word spread throughout Spain, but it spread throughout Portugal that he had found supposedly a new route to India. It wasn't, he didn't reach India, but nevertheless, that's when they decided that they were going to take, meaning the Spanish and Portuguese, were going to steal whatever this new area was. But the Pope had to step in and broker a treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas in
1494.
In
June 7,
1494.
1494.
In
Yes.
1494, absolutely. So
Hmm.
they carved up the entire area, and they didn't even know where the hell they were. They just started. They said, "Look, we know West Africa, so let's go so many leagues based on his 10 weeks, so many leagues to the west to try to figure out where he landed." They thought he was in islands near India. So anyway, the treaty actually divided all of the Americas, and
Right.
Spain got the western portion, and Portugal got the eastern portion. But the bottom line is that it split South America, and that's why in Brazil people officially speak Portuguese because of that treaty. But nevertheless, the Moors and the African voyages before that, and the map making and the cartography had a definite influence on Columbus taking the risk. It was a risk for them because they had no one in the West had tried that before. Yes, the Vikings had come, but they had not tried the southern route of Columbus. So it's a lot that is there. But the bottom line is that these are very, very important episodes of a fundamental influence of the Moors. And by the way, the Spanish were absolutely impacted by the Moors. They called people Moors, which is short for Black or Moor.
Right.
And they called the women Mora.
Mora.
Mora, you know, to feminize it. So, and then people with names like Maurice and Morrison, that's that's an influence of the Moorish influence by name. So it's quite a contribution that the Moors made to provide a foundation for the modern European growth and development out of the Dark Ages.
Absolutely. We can see the impact. Dr. Jose Pimenta Bay talks about how we can see the lasting impact of the African Moors in the language in Europe, words in European language, Maurice, different things like that. This is in reference to a Moorish boy, in their architecture. Also, he talks about in their bloodline. So they're changing the complexions of a lot of Europeans in Spain and Portugal, to a lesser extent in, say, England, because that's further west from when they're going in from Morocco right into the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. But we see this, we see them go all throughout Europe. And he talks about the word Schwarzenegger, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, where Neger is Austrian and German for Negro, and Schwartz is in reference to dark or swarthy. Okay, so and you study Arnold Schwarzenegger, he comes from Austria. In the bodybuilding world, he was known as the Austrian Oak. So you go and you look at that history, and they lay out a lot of it here in the book that we mentioned, Golden Age of the Moor, edited by Dr. Ivan van Sertima. And there's so many scholars that have essays there. So that shows you the connection between the Nile Valley region of Africa, and also some of the Moors, to a lesser extent, come from West Africa. There are different waves that go in, you know, over the hundreds of years, but to a lesser extent, West Africa. But you see, they're taking the teachings from Africa, which was the continent of knowledge, and they're taking the light of Africa into the dark continent, Europe, which was in the Dark Ages. Okay, so we're taught to look at Africa as the dark continent, when really Europe was the dark continent. Europe was pushed into what they refer to as the Dark Ages, 476 AD, when the Vandals and the Visigoths crushed that western portion of the Roman Empire. And then you have hundreds of years of civil war and strife and famine, different things like this in Europe. So we have a lot of this history backwards. And I think when we start, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in fact, this is what I cover in my book. So I have a section on the Moors in Spain from 711 to 1492. Okay. So that's an actual section to lay out the Moorish influence. But we also have to go back much earlier, because the influence, the early African influence on the Greeks and Romans is much earlier and is absolutely profound. It's a profound influence. And one thing that people should know is that when the Greeks came in the 4th century before the Common Era under Alexander of Macedon, and they came in as political invaders and took over classical Kemet, or so-called Egypt, the Greeks did not claim that they had originated this information and knowledge that people think that they're giving credit for today. So
Right.
in astrology and astronomy and medicine and religious rituals and mathematics and geometry, the Greeks did not claim this at all. This was done by scholars at the University of Göttingen in Germany in the late 1700s and early 1800s. They're the ones that rewrote the history of the world, and they took the ancient model and replaced it with the Aryan model. But if we look at what the Greeks and Romans did, it was unusual, where they politically conquered the civilization of Kemet, but they culturally were following the practices of those that they conquered. This is very unusual. People usually, they imposed their language and their political structure. It was the opposite. They were imitating African ceremonies, imitating African rituals, taking on African ceremonies, worshiping African gods, marrying African women, and so forth. That's what they were doing. But when they came, the civilization was already gone. It had disappeared, but they were imitating the early African civilization, and they did not claim. The Greeks and Romans did not claim that they created any of this. Like Lucian and Diodorus and Herodotus and Homer, they give great credit to Africans. Not once did any of them claim anything that they were the originators of. So it's very important to know that that the early African influence took place over 2,000 years ago. And then what we were discussing, the Moorish influence, is another episode of a fundamental and a profound African influence upon Europe, because the Greeks did not, like, for example, even during the classical period, they did not have libraries. Even then, they didn't have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they didn't have libraries. All of a sudden now, Alexander invades Kemet, and they didn't go in and start, quote unquote, building libraries. You don't start building institutions abroad that you don't have at home. Correct. And so this is one of the important things for folks to know. So there's libraries in temples throughout Kemet. You can see the lot. So when I'm leading tours, we go inside the temple and you see where they kept the scrolls, the libraries. And the Greeks came around and they start, as I mentioned, imitating African practices. And you can tell the difference, because when they come in, they don't understand it. They are trying to duplicate, but it goes from high-level art and execution to crude, clumsy, and incompetent imitations. And you can see the crude, clumsy, and incompetent imitations in the outrageous paintings, and then it's just drawing. It's not spiritual anymore. It's just drawing. And it's like, for example, you have people with two arms and two left arms or two right hands, because they don't know what they're doing anymore. And so this is what's happening. But nevertheless, the influence was profound. And this is why I wanted to do the book, the second edition, and add a little bit more, because we got to make sure that it's very, very clear that a lot of the contributions that people think are European or Greek are not. For example, chemistry, the original word is Kemet. We can look at the etymology or the history of the word, and I put the etymology in that, and also wanted to make it very clear that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the square of the hypotenuse. This is clearly documented by the Africans on a scroll that's in the British Museum. That this has nothing to do with Pythagoras. So the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, geometry that every 10th grader has to learn, this is made up. But this was fabricated by those outrageous scholars in Germany in the late 1700s who rewrote the history of the world with no new evidence or data. And they took the Greek and Roman texts and turned them upside down and dismissed them, because they had no problem giving Africans credit. And that's why people should read the Greek writers. They not once did they ever disparage Africans. They gave them high praise, even so much to say Herodotus says that the best looking people in the world were Ethiopians. He's talking about Kushites. Usually the people think they're the best looking, but they said, no, the Africans were the best looking. So that's how much credit they gave to Africans in the early period, going back a couple thousand years.
Yeah, a lot of this really gets turned around in the 1700s and especially in the 1800s when the Western world discovers ancient Kush, and they are astonished by the civilization that was built and didn't want to credit that civilization to what they call Negroes. Talk for a minute about ancient Kush, and in that conversation, because from my understanding, Kush was more of a region than a country. It may change at certain periods of time, but it was more of a region. But you also have what we call ancient Nubia or Ta-Nehisi. So talk about those for a minute, please.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, one of the things that gets distorted is that the vast number of people, they are using the anti-African archaeologist George Reisner.
Mm-hmm.
And Reisner had warped racial beliefs. So he did field work from 1907 to about 1932 in Egypt and Sudan, the Northeast African corridor. And the further he went south, the more disturbed Reisner was, because he saw black-skinned people and clear evidence of an African civilization complex. So Reisner began to distort and misrepresent what he was finding. And he was really frustrated because he was there with the absurd mission of looking for a white queen and couldn't find one. So Reisner, he's on a mad search for a white queen. So he's fabricating information. So the further he went south, he's seeing Kushites, but in his mind, he can't give credit to them. He said that these people were incapable of these kind of developments. So he's mislabeling them. So what's happening now, and people are running with the ideas and the chronology of an anti-African racist, and everyone agrees to that, but people still use his framework. How could that make sense? His framework is based on the fact he can't give credit. So what happens is that the older civilization of Kush came first, and then Nubia, and then Kemet. But Reisner does not give credit to the older version of the older original Kush. And that's what's the most ancient part. But people are not in the field going to those places where there are still Kushitic groups that are in isolated locations, because it's not easy to get there. And people are using Reisner's framework. So what happens is that the Kushites are just labeled the so-called black pharaohs who came much later and were imitating people in Kemet or Egypt. Imitating, they're originating. And not only they're originating, but their style is different. How they wore the crowns is different. They had not one cobra on the crown, but two. The shape of the pyramids, and they have it tapered on each corner, is very different. So it's a distinctive style, but there's cultural overlap because they're in one ecosystem. They're in one cultural complex up and down the Nile Valley. But Kush is the original civilization that goes to the south. That's why I've been doing work in not just Egypt, but I had to go further south to Sudan and southern Ethiopia and Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda. That's the region where you have Kushitic groups that are still around today that speak a Kushitic language. They don't know about old Kush, but they certainly know that they're part of Kush in some way. Like, for example, when I'm in South Sudan, it's interesting because they have a Kush bank in South Sudan. They have Kush Airlines, and people speaking a Kushitic language. They understand, they respect Kush. They just don't know about the ancient part, but they can explain how they are practicing today, their cultural practices, and they know it relates to Kush, you know, whether it's in South Sudan or southern Ethiopia among the different groups. And so this has been my work to really help to uncover the deep history of Kush. So I coined the term Kushology, although there are previous scholars, Drusilla Dungy Houston, and there's been John G. Jackson and Chancellor Williams, but they were using the term Ethiopia, the Greek word, and the word Ethiops means burnt face, black face, or kissed by the sun, but that's what the Greeks called it, but they're referring to Kush. So there's early scholars that we have to give credit to. And so what I did, I coined the term Kushology in order to define and explain the field work that I continue to do in an area, because Kush is the oldest, and we don't know that much about it because it's difficult work in the field, and we have to have the right framework in order to understand it, because there are so many groups that have words and terms and practices that link directly back to Kush, but it's either ignored or the practice is mislabeled. So, for example, I remember on Facebook, when was this, a couple of years ago, I was showing that the people at the Louvre in Paris, they don't know what they're talking about. They've labeled some Kushites as Nubians. Now, we know Nubia was a high-level culture in the past. It's a great group and cultural group today, but they labeled the Kushites as Nubians, but we know they're not Nubians because of the cultural markings, not scarification. That's a European assessment of it. It's better to just call it cultural markings, and the cultural markings of those in South Sudan, for example, are very distinctive from other groups, and they're distinctive from Nubians. So when you have cultural markings across the forehead, it's very specific. When you go to South Sudan, it's very clear that they're Nuer, Dinka, or Mandari. And they'll tell you, the elders will tell you that no, because this one dips a little bit, or this one, the cut goes to the ear, and they're very distinct. This one is from Rubik. This one is from Ural. They'll tell you the regions of where this person's from by the cultural markings, and you can see those cultural markings in antiquity. These are Kushites, but then they're mislabeled as Nubian. Difference because you can't know from or a general description. Go there and see, you know what I mean? And so that's what I've been doing to really, and to understand the roots of ancient Kush.
Okay, now,
and then
go ahead. Okay, you mentioned the Mandinka. You said the Mandinka, right?
The Mandari.
Oh, Mandari. I thought you said Mandinka. Okay. Because I know Mandinka in West Africa. Okay, Mandari. But I do know that Africans migrated from the Nile Valley region into Central Africa, into West Africa. We didn't stay put. We migrated different times, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes because of invasions. Because, I interviewed Professor James Small 2023, I think it was. And one of the things that came up in the conversation is Africans being pushed southward and then also into Central Africa and later West Africa when you have Arab invasions. After Arabs conquer Egypt, 642, Common Era, and then you have subsequent subsequent Arab oppression, things like this. You have Africans that are going to going to migrate. So we didn't stay put. You talked about.
If I can say this too, Brother Michael.
Go ahead.
The other, yes, that's one reason for migrations. It's invaders, and for political reasons. The other reasons for the migrations is changing weather patterns. Yes, because there's an ebb and flow in weather patterns. Because when I work with a NASA project, I studied the ancient weather patterns, and those also dictate migrations to not only to West Africa, but there's migrations also to the east as well. Like folks won't necessarily know that there's a branch of the Nile River called Wadi Howard. The Wadi Howard branch cuts across Africa and empties into the Atlantic. And you can see that from the aerial photography, from the remote sensing, you can see the actual channel of the Wadi Howard branch of the Nile. And so that's very important, because then that would indicate where there would be settlements at.
Right.
And so forth. Yeah, I just wanted to mention. So, yes, in addition to what you said, there's the weather-related
patterns,
forced migrations too. Yeah.
You talked earlier in our conversation today, and those just tuning in, we're speaking with historian Professor Manu Ampim, and we're talking about his book, A History of African Civilizations. And we're also going to talk about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Month, and the father of Black history in just a minute, because he has a section in volume 2 of his book that deals with Dr. Carter G. Woodson and Dr. Carter G. Woodson's research in Africa, dealing with Africa, African history, etc. And we've also been talking about the need for primary research. Earlier in our conversation, and also the broadcast you did on your Facebook page, December 15th, 2023, which is one of the reasons why I reached out to you and said I wanted to have you back on the show to discuss to discuss your book. You talked about the short-statured Africans, okay, also known as the Khoisan, some refer to as the Twa. Talk about them for a minute. And from my understanding, my research, they went all around the world. They circumnavigated the globe as well. Talk about those short-statured Africans for a minute, please.
Yeah. My book, A History of African Civilizations, it's pretty easy for people to think civilizations being spectacular cultures that built mighty monuments and structures and temples and tombs and pyramids. But that's just more advanced civilizations, the small stature people that are negatively called pygmy. We don't ever use that word, but they represent the first Homo sapiens sapiens. Those that are the first anatomical humans going back to about 250,000 years ago. Not half ape, not half monkey, but flesh, blood, and bone human beings who could join us as a third person, and we wouldn't even take a second look. But those small stature people, we've been knowing about this because of the DNA research of Dr. Rebecca Kahn and her team going back to 1987. The old bones have been found by the Leakeys and other folks in East Africa, but the DNA research supported that. And now we know that everybody comes from a single African ancestor. We know that there's only one type of human is Africans. And those small stature people, 4'8", 4'10", they're the Mbuti, the Ife, the San. Sometimes it could be the Khoi and the Khoisan, or these different groups. And the small stature gave them an advantage because, first of all, in their mobility. Also, there's a less need for calories and so forth. But these are the people that stood up and taught us what it meant to be human. They're the ones who are the great ecologists that live in complete harmony with their environment. They're the ones that taught us the great ethical laws. So their position is an idea, and what rules in their society is do unto nature as you would have nature do unto you. And so there's no structure, there's no hierarchy, there's no chiefs, there's no kings. They're semi-nomadic because they don't farm. They just forage, they hunt, they fish, and they'll stay at a place for a couple of weeks or so. And when they leave camp, you'll never know that they were there. So these are the people that really represent the first ones that taught us civilization, not the advanced groups. That's later, because civilization, and I've defined it in the book, civilization is peaceful and harmonious relations among people and between people and their environment. That's peaceful and harmonious relations among people and between people and their environment, because at the root of the word civilization, the basis of it is civil. And when we have civil relations, we have peaceful relations. So those are the ones that live in harmony. And by the way, these small stature folks, they're not aggressive. They don't fight wars. They don't fight over ideology. So the large aggressive people have put them at jeopardy. So all of these people, as they've migrated, because there's always push and pull factors, the push factors would have been the changing weather or the lack of resources now. And and everyone knows that animals migrate when the seasons change, whether it's birds, wildebeest, you name it. And so when the food supply moves, the people must move to survive. And the only way in which a group can be sedentary, they must be able to farm, and they can create a storehouse of food. So that the small stature first Homo sapiens sapiens, yes, they migrated into certain areas, and in some cases in Asia, they did not change their physical appearance because the weather pattern is the same. You look at the folks in Indonesia, in Philippines and other places, they're as Africoid in their appearance as anyone else, whereas others did change. In Europe, they changed. In Asia, they changed. They differentiated is what the term is, because it's the law is either adapt or die. But these are the people that taught us these great laws of sharing and caring, because they lived in plentiful environments, and they are the ones that have provided a tremendous foundation for civilized life and conduct. But what propagandists have done is overlook these small stature people and then say civilization means something else. So they can include Greek and Roman. So they'll say civilizations when you have farming, metallurgy, cities, and
writing,
government and writing. And and those 5 elements. Well, wait a minute. The problem is those are things, but they don't deal with the quality of relationships. You know, it's like the Romans. They were very brutal. All they did was fight and enslave people. What's civilized about that?
Exactly.
So that's the distinction I'm making in the book, that you have real civilized folks, the small stature Africans that were the first Homo sapiens sapiens, and they represent the true definition of civil relationships, as opposed to some contrived, made up, fake and phony definition that doesn't make sense. Like we're told that the origin of so-called civilization is in Athens, Greece, in the 5th century before the Common Era. How could that make any sense when 80 to 90% of the people in Greece were not even citizens, had no political rights, couldn't even vote, and that was all women, the poor, foreigners, and slaves had no rights in Greece. Where in the hell is a democracy? It's not a democracy of the people, for the people, by the people. It's a democracy for the few. This has been a bogus presentation to the world to say that the Greeks somehow created civilization when they were anything but civilized in their conduct towards the people in Greek society. And besides that, all they were doing fighting all day long.
Right.
So
exactly.
This is what has to be looked at to separate the facts from fiction.
Okay, now the Khoisan, they date back, their ancestral line dates back somewhere at least 100,000 years ago, maybe longer than that, something like that. Now the Khoisan, we know they go into the Philippines, they circumnavigate the globe. Was there a presence of the Khoisan here in the land that we call the United States of America, or a greater aspect, North America? Was there a presence of the Khoisan?
There was not, but what we know is this, and so we know that the oldest group, so the Khoisan, so you mean like this is in Southern African area. But in East Africa, this is like near Tanzania and the Olduvai Gorge area, and even the DNA work research with Dr. Khan and her team dealing with mitochondrial DNA seems to support an Eastern African origin. But what we do know is that these small stature people certainly have gone into Asia. They're very short stature. And we know that they were dark skinned when they left and they went into Europe. And this is why they have rickets, which is a deficiency of vitamin D.
Right.
Yeah, because the melanin is going to block some of the ultraviolet rays of the sun. Now, what we do have in the Americas, we definitely have the oldest inhabitants of all of the Americas is in South America, in Pedra Ferrada, Brazil. So the evidence from Pedra Ferrada, Brazil, the oldest documented occupation in the Western Hemisphere, it goes back to at least 56,000 years ago because of the discovery of rock art and hearths. A hearth is a fireplace. And so we've been knowing about Pedra Ferrada, Brazil, in the Sierra de Capoeira National Park. We've been knowing about that since 1986. And that's when they discovered the site. And first they had the date of Pedra Ferrada at 48,000 years ago, but the discovery of the hearths, the fireplaces, pushes it back to 56,000 years ago. But that's in South America, because the reason why people were not in North America, because there would have been no way to come to the area because of the warm glacial period. The whole northern hemisphere was still locked up in ice, and the ice didn't begin to melt until about 25,000 years ago, and it created a corridor. It created an opening that allowed people to migrate from Siberia in Asia across this opening in the ice into North America. But this opening didn't take place until much, much later than the settlements in South America, which means that
the Bering Straits.
So Bering Strait was afterwards, but what we know is that the people migrated by watercraft, and this is one of the problems that early historians have, is that they have this absurd idea that the waters were somehow, the waterways, the oceans and seas were somehow a barrier to travel, when in fact the waterways have been a facilitator of travel. People have always been ingenious in traveling. So
Right.
it's clear that they were in Page of Ferrata. The rock art doesn't lie. The hearths don't lie. I mean, who paints like that? Who creates fire? Why do we need fire? To cook food, to keep warm, to keep away animals, for light. So we use fire, and no other species does that. So what the propagandists who want to maintain the Bering Strait theory, and matter of fact, I have a unit in that in my class. We call it not the Bering Strait theory, but the BS theory, and it's a BS theory because people did migrate through the opening in the ice, but the part of it that's incorrect and is BS is that somehow represents the first inhabitants. No.
Right.
There were people that were already in the Americas, not only in Page of Ferrata, Brazil, but Monteverde, Chile, going back 33,000 years ago, or Huilactico, Mexico. There's a number of different sites in the Americas long before people migrated through the Bering Strait, so that the small-statured people, and there's not really a clear indication of the height of the people in Page of Ferrata, but their Africoid identity is very clear from the images. That makes it very, very clear that they were of Africoid descent. I'm sorry, Brother Michael. One other thing that's very important, that in all over the world, including in Africa, the small-statured people, all of them, with no exceptions, they live today in places of refuge, hiding, and safety. So they live in rainforests, like the Ituri rainforest in Democratic Republic of the Congo, or they'll live in desert environments like the Kalahari Desert, like the Khoi and the other people, the San, or they'll live in islands, hillsides. But that's where these people live, in places of isolation and hiding and safety, because they're not aggressive. They don't fight. And this is why they don't fare well in the modern world. But everywhere we see them, they're in isolated, remote areas for safety and refuge. And that's what is very, very important to know. And in South America, the evidence seems very clear that they were attacked much later by those that came through the Bering Strait. And people can find a documentary. It's called Tracking the First Americans.
Tracking the First Americans.
That one is very well done because it's on the work of Dr. Walter Neves, who's an archaeologist from Brazil, and those researchers, Professor Guidon, who worked at the Page of Ferrata site, so that they have some reference to what I'm sharing, because I don't cover all of these details in my book, but in my class, we go into great detail about these migrations.
There was an article from the New York Times that I use in my classes, and I need to pull this up because it talks about an African presence in Brazil, and I forgot the name of that, and I'm looking for my file folder also, but it talks about the African presence in Brazil, and is going back tens of thousands of years ago. And let me see if I can try to find this. It's going back tens of thousands of years ago, but also you have I think there was a presence in Tierra del Fuego in South America, the southern tip.
The tip, yeah, Argentina.
Well, the southern tip of South America.
Right.
I'm gonna see if I can find that article. Okay, so when you talk about Dr. Carter G. Woodson in your book as well, and you in the broadcast that you did December 15th, 2023, you talked about how Dr. Carter G. Woodson is left out of the conversation dealing with African history, African culture, things of this nature. But his last two books dealt with African history. He had African history background, and then he was working on another one. But he also had a book on African folklore, African myths and folklore as well. Talk about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who most of us know, co-founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, September 9th, 1915, created Negro History Week, second week in February 1926. Talk about his research in Africa, dealing with African history and culture.
Yeah, that's one of the most important developments in the 20th century regarding African civilizations. Carter G. Woodson is very much omitted without justification from the focus and discussion on bringing African civilizations to the forefront. One of the things that Woodson did, I mean, he created his organization, the Association for the Study, at that time is called Negro Life and History. Now it's Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And Woodson began to do his work in the early 20th century. And when Woodson was around up until when he passed in 1950, his focus was increasingly on African civilizations. But from the time that Woodson led the charge to make the focus on history of Black people front and center, when he created the week in the second week of February 1926, Africa had always been a central component for Woodson. So, and he's left out. So a couple of things that folks should know. He wrote several books on Africa. You mentioned African myths and folktales. That was one. The last two books he wrote was African Heroes and Heroines. And the last book is the African Background Outline. That was the last two books. Not only that, but the last three articles written by the great scholar who passed in 1950. The last three articles written by Woodson was a article series simply called Egypt, a 3-part series, and it was called Egypt because for Woodson the mission was to bring back the missing pages, the missing chapters, and the missing volumes of the Black contribution to U.S. and world history. So for Woodson, this was unacceptable that Black people had been written out of the story of U.S. and world history and contributions. So for him, it was to establish our humanity. So when Woodson is focusing on in his essays and his books and his presentations to his organization, when he's arguing that there has to be the missing pages put back into the story, he's not just talking about the experience here in the U.S. He's looking at a global experience. When he says world history, he means just that. But so when Woodson was around, not only is he writing about African civilizations in his articles, his essays, and his books, but even the theme of the organization. You look at the organizational themes, and you see a number of themes during the lifetime of Woodson dealing specifically with Africa. Since that time, the organization's moved away from Woodson's position on Africa. And the problem is that people don't even know. If they look at the journal of the journal, now it's a Journal of African American Life and History, but the Journal of Negro History, when that was founded in 1916, the very first issue is dealing with Africa. And not only that, but he has a team of writers who are focusing on Africa. So they from the very first issue of the journal, Volume 1, Number 1, there's several articles dealing with Africa, and they constantly did book reviews, and they're on Africa, not only from the first issue of the volume of the journal all the way through. But not only that, but even the bulletin. Later on, they created the bulletin of then it was called Bulletin of Negro History. Now it's a Bulletin of the Black History Bulletin. But in 1937, the very first issue, Woodson, as the editor, he has a big old picture of Africa on page 6, a big old picture on the very first issue. And in fact, all the way through, there is focus on Africa, and this gets left out of the scholarly discussion. And when scholars are looking at the Black history movement, they leave out Woodson and his unique focus on African civilizations. Like, for example, let me just give one example of what gets left out. So in March of 1939, the so-called Negro History Bulletin, which was designed and focused on for teachers, so that teachers can teach the students, this is what Woodson wrote. He says sculpture reached its first. Sorry, let me go to the title. The title is "The Negro in Art: From Africa to America," and this is the March 1939 issue, Volume 2, Number 6. And this is what Woodson writes. He says sculpture reached its first high level in ancient times under the Egyptians. The Sphinx near the pyramids of Giza, the temple at Luxor, the rock temple at Abu Simbel, and the obelisk show the greatness of Egyptian architecture and sculpture. And so he's claiming Egypt or Kemet as an African civilization, but he's writing articles all the way through. He's reviewing books like Lorenzo Turner on Africanisms in the Gullah dialect, and Woodson's reviewing the books like that because Africa was front and center for Woodson. There's not a time that Woodson was not writing articles and or books about Africa, or his organization having themes dealing specifically with Africa. What Osla has done, and you mentioned Daryl Scott, he's one of the last persons defending Woodson when Woodson said that self-publishing is self-defense. And so what the organization has done, they've left out Woodson's work on Africa, not because it's not there, because they're uncomfortable. So Professor Scott, Dr. Scott, he was arguing that how in the world could you disregard the work of Woodson when he established in 1922 Associated Publishers? He said that
Associated Publishers Inc. Yep, the publishing company.
1922. And so the thing is that Woodson said that nobody can edit and change your work if you're publishing yourself. So that's why for him, he can say whatever he wanted to say. Like you had the great book there, The Miseducation. He was able to say what he wanted to say, when he wanted to say it, and who he wanted to say it to. But what the organization did is decide to disrespect the tradition, disrespect Woodson. And now if you want to get the journal, you got to go through the University of Chicago. And Dr. Scott was one of the last battlers to say, this doesn't make sense. This is not Woodson. This is not Woodson's tradition. But guess what? Those folks are the ones, and they may be listening. So what? Challenge the evidence. They're the ones uncomfortable with Africa. That's why they.
I get that impression. I get that impression that many of them are uncomfortable with Africa.
They're uncomfortable with Africa, and that's why they would rather give up independence against Woodson's position and give the publication to the University of Chicago. So, folks, if you want to get the journal of what's now called a Journal of African American History, or get the back issues of the Journal of Negro History, you got to go through the big mainstream institution, University of Chicago Press, and not through the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, because those professionals who have the money and the resources to remain independent, but they don't have the orientation. So they disrespect Woodson and they disrespect his tradition. There's no defense to it. So kudos to the guest you had on, because Brother
Dr. Daryl Scott.
Daryl Scott, he's one of the last ones fighting to try to keep a respectful focus on Woodson's vision. So not only has the organization give up the independent publishing apparatus, but they've abandoned Africa. And you look at the themes. Now everything is African American. There's nothing wrong with that. But look, Brother Michael, here's how we do it in the Woodson tradition.
And I have some of the themes. Go ahead, keep talking, because we got some of the themes. Because there's been a theme. There's been an annual theme for Black History Month, Negro History Week, African American History Month since 1928. Yes. Okay, and Dr. Woodson picked these themes. He died in 1950. Go ahead and then we're going to go over a few of these themes that dealt with Africa, because most African Americans don't know there's been an annual theme for Black History Month. When I do my presentations on African American History Month, I said we don't have to keep recycling the same 15 to 20 sanitized Negroes every year. We don't understand how powerful this monthly cultural celebration is and why it was actually created. Go ahead.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, to that list, we'll also put 1972 on that list: African art, music, literature, and a valuable cultural experience. But look, I'm glad you have that there, because this is new information that gets omitted. So if we look at the focus of the annual themes, Africa's front and center, because when Woodson said that the goal was to put back in the missing pages of world history, what the hell do you think they was talking about? World history is talking about Africa. So that's why you have African themes. And the last Africa theme was really 1992, because and it was because of the great work of Van Sertima and others who challenged and exposed Columbus, and that's about it since that time. But everything's been just okay. Now here's what we do in the tradition of Woodson. Two important things I want people to know. Number one,
okay,
in the current theme by Asala, and they set the national theme for those that follow them. This year is African Americans and labor. So we changed it. It's we have ours was the classical African contributions in art from Africa to the Americas, because for us there's no way to separate the Black experience in the Americas from the African background and origin. And so whenever they have a theme only focusing on African American, we add the African component to it every single time. But
right.
So they have African Americans in the arts. That's okay, but it's not in the Woodsonian tradition. The Woodsonian tradition would be the achievements in art in Africa and the Americas. That's why I read this article he wrote, "The Negro in Art from Africa to America." That's in the Woodsonian tradition, and but the people are not comfortable with Africa. And like the great Kwame Ture said, if you start your history in slavery, the best you can be is a good slave. And that's what we're dealing with now. We have people that have disrespected Woodson, and they have only focused on African American because that's what they're comfortable with. So that's one issue to be aware of. The other issue is that it should be properly called. If we're following Woodson's direction and his leadership and his insight, it should be called African Heritage Month, because that's what we're focusing on, African heritage. When people say Black History Month, to them, it means to focus on issues of struggle, of how Black people overcome slavery, escape slavery, or how they got their ass kicked by the police or something like that. Right. And what Woodson was concerned about after the celebration was founded in 1926, if we see Woodson in the 1930s, he's criticizing at that time what was being done, always talking about something negative in Black people. He said, look, we have to assert our humanity. We have to look at Black contributions, achievements, and contributions in the world, and not always associate Black people with a problem. This is why Woodson focused on it as a celebration, and he's embracing Africa. They had plays, they had all kind of skits, plays, all kind of things, important information about contributions, because Woodson understood that we had to assert our humanity and use at least some time of the year to focus on our unique achievements, accomplishments, and contributions in the world. And this is why he continues to embrace Africa. So as he's learning more, he's writing more about it. But what's happened is that people are more and more, they're uncomfortable with Africa. They leave out Woodson's focus on Africa. So when they say Black History Month, it means really, as some of us would say, it's a Negro version where you're only dealing with safe folks who are only, you can only talk about them if they're fighting against slavery or during the civil rights or human rights era, which are great struggles, but it's very limited in scope. And so African Heritage Month means that we have to embrace Africa as we look at the overall Black contributions. This is why at our college, we've always had themes that associate the celebration. That's what we have with Africa and our experience in the Americas. And we tell folks that we do not endorse all of the negativity you all want to bring in February, because this is a chance for us to assert our humanity. So it should be African Heritage Month as a reminder that Africa must be the foundation for our perspective. But those that are dealing with Black History Month, most of that is negative. Like, for example, I saw a flyer, somebody shared something with me that somebody had a Black History Month event, and all I saw was a fashion show and some drinking. So what the hell is this? This is a Black History Month event. You know what I mean? Because it ain't got nothing to do with Africa, and it's got nothing to do with contributions to humanity. So, Brother Michael, what's important is that we reteach and re-educate even the informed community, the so-called, whatever they call it, the conscious community, to shift. Because this is the only way in which we can take back the focus created by Woodson and separate it from all this craziness and make sure that we define it as African Heritage Month and force people to have positive events that embrace our unique contributions to humanity, which I lay out in my book. I have a whole section on these contributions in math, medicine, architecture, social organization, medicine, you name it. And these contributions must be front and center. And this is what the concern was of Woodson, as he was criticizing those folks that only focused on problems and not the contributions of Black people.
Excellent, excellent. And the name of Professor Manu Ampim's book again is A History of African Civilizations. This is the second revised edition, A History of African Civilizations. You can get it at his website, advancingtheresearch.org, advancingtheresearch.org. We have it up here on the screen. We're going to put the link again here in the thread of the broadcast. Please support this brother. Order his book today. This is great reading material, great material to use with your children. I'm going to pull this back up, this slide I have, because this is a slide from my African American History Month presentations. And this is research I did years ago. If we just look at some of the themes, now there's been an annual theme since 1928. And if you go to Asala's website, asala.org, asalh.org, they have all the themes going back to 1928, annual themes. 1928, Civilization, a World Achievement. 1933, Ethiopia meets Era in Truth. 1935, the Negro Achievements in Africa. 1936, African Background Outlined. Now, we know Dr. Woodson died in 1950, but 1960, the annual theme was Strengthening America Through Education in Negro History and African Culture. I don't understand how you deal with Negro history and African culture, but okay. This is 1960. But in 1971, African Civilization and Culture, a Worthy Historical Background. And then we know let me see, I have Asala's website up here right now. We know in, let's see, 1992, you talked about African Roots, Experience New Worlds, Pre-Columbus to Spatial Exploration. So that was the 500-year commemoration of Columbus setting sail on his first voyage. 1987, Afro-Americans and the Constitution from colonial times to the present, etc. Go ahead and talk about that for a minute. And then I have the article that I was looking for from the New York Times that talks about Brazil and South America.
Yeah, these themes, it clearly shows Woodson's consistent and well-rounded focus on Africa. And as you mentioned, he passed in 1950. So when the themes continued in 1960, 1971, 1972, it's because these are people that was still around, that he was mentoring and influenced. But as time has gone on, they've separated. I'm talking about the organization from Woodson's focus on Africa, and the community and the public has fallen into this, unfortunately, of separating Woodson from Africa and separating his scholarship from Africa, because Woodson more and more was focusing on Egypt, Ethiopia. I mean, I can read so many different articles and statements that he made about Ethiopia as the forerunner of Kemet. He says that Ethiopia, Kush came first. It was the forerunner. And his book,
Ethiopia and Kush, Abyssinia. The grandmother, yes. Go ahead. He's
talking about that, and he's mentioning in his book, the Negro in Our History. This is when, in 1922, this is when he starts to focus on this. And the Negro in Our History, this was the definitive textbook for decades until John Hope Franklin wrote his book. But before John Hope Franklin's book, From Slavery to Freedom, Woodson's book, the Negro in Our History, was the standard text. And so every aspect of his work, including the organization, you see it through the themes. You see Woodson's influence on Africa. But Brother Michael, we would never know that today if you read and listen to these scholars today. It ain't that the evidence is hard to find. Like you say, anybody can go to Oslo's website and see the themes and see the other publications. It's not difficult, but of course, now you got to go to the University of Chicago. You can get some of these early volumes and get the articles on. So this is why it was important for me in the second revised edition this is why it was important for me to expand the second edition and include a chapter on Woodson to blow up the myths and misinformation that is across the board. I mean, you know, people who've read a lot, they know about the miseducation of the Negro, but there's a lot of other crucial and critical things that are not known about Woodson because we haven't read deeply enough, and scholars have carefully omitted Woodson's work on Africa. And that's why it's very important for me to get this information out. And when I've been doing presentations, people have been very surprised. Like for example, to show you Woodson's work, as he's the editor of the journal, so Journal of Negro History, Volume 1, Number 1, January 1916. Look, they have the first edition, first issue. This is what was impressive about Woodson. He wasn't writing alone. He had a team of writers that was making this contribution. So Monroe wrote a piece called "The Passing Tradition and the African Civilization." This is the very first issue. And then there's Stafford, who wrote a book, "The Mind of the African Negro, Africans, as reflected in this Proverbs." Then there is, and then there's a book review, another book review, "Negro Culture in West Africa." Mm-hmm. So you got this in the very first volume. Woodson pulls together a pool of writers to help support his writing and scholarship in the area. So it's a body of writers focusing on Africa in the very early period, over 100 years ago. And we would never know that until we pull up those themes, which are public. You don't even have to register and become a member to see that. And then, and you got the journal, and there's the bulletin, plus there's Woodson's work. So this is why I added the chapter to the book, in order to blow up this nonsense about the misrepresentation. You talk about the miseducation of the Negro. This is miseducation all over again by his own organization, miseducating people about their own founder. And I'll challenge anybody, because documentation beats conversation. Is right there.
Absolutely.
And this is a key. And you know what? This is the second time in my research that I found this. The first was when I was shocked to see that the biggest file that Dr. King kept was his file on Africa and the African liberation movements. So here you got two 20th century giants, and people around them have totally misrepresented the record because they're not comfortable. And not because these men didn't focus on Africa, it's because the propagandists have decided to omit this information. That's why it's so crucial, brother, to challenge people and make sure that we begin to call it and conceive of it and execute February as African Heritage Month, to break away from the craziness around Black History Month, where you got nothing but superficial events that have nothing to do with Woodson, and we should not want any part of that. And just to give people example, if they don't know what I'm talking about, they had an event at UC Berkeley out here a few years ago. It was some black guy. He had apparently success at getting some white nationalists out of the KKK. So that became a Black History Month event to show his success in getting some white supremacists out of the KKK. And they put that on our website at the college. Somebody told me about it. I said, you know what? You got a few minutes to take that nonsense down. So we don't support that. How in the hell does this become a part of our sacred celebration? You know, it's about achievements, accomplishments and contributions in the world, and to assert our humanity and not deal with all of the negativity that we hear and know about and learn about all the time. We cannot always associate Black people with a problem, but that's why I'm focusing on it and really telling the community we got to break away and move forward in February in the Woodsonian tradition and embrace Africa.
Exactly. And just so people know, Dr. Woodson chose the second week in February, not because February is the shortest month of the year, but because it contains the birth dates of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, the assumed birth date of Douglass. Douglass didn't know his exact birth date, so he took the birth date of February 14th. Most of us know that as Valentine's Day. And then Abraham Lincoln's birthday, February 12th, because going back to when Frederick Douglass dies in 1895. Basically, each birthday after that, we had celebrations in our community for Frederick Douglass. And then also there were celebrations that we had in our community for Abraham Lincoln's birthday as well, after, Lincoln's assassinated in 1865. So because those two, you already had those celebrations taking place in the African-American community, Dr. Woodson inserted this new cultural holiday, this new cultural celebration into that period. Okay, so that's why it's in February. It has nothing to do with February being the coldest month of the year, the shortest month of the year, and it's not something white people gave us either. Right. I hear this myth also. White people gave us the month of February. No, we took it. Okay, we created this. I want to go to this article here. This is the one I was looking for. This is from the New York Times. Discoveries challenge beliefs on humans' arrival in the Americas. Okay, and it talks about Sarah de Capavera, which is what you were talking about. This is from March 27th, 2014, Simon Romero for the New York Times. It talks about Dr. Guidon, who you mentioned, and this is one I use in my classes, but it talks about right here. Researchers here say they have unearthed stone tools proving that humans reached what is now northeast Brazil as early as 22,000 years ago. The discovery adds to the growing body of research upending a prevailing belief of 20th century archaeology in the United States known as the Clovis model, also called the Clovis culture or what have you, in New Mexico, which holds that people first arrived in the Americas from Asia about 13,000 years ago. So I think this is what you were talking about?
Partly, brother. Partly. The problem with this article is like the articles that I share with students is that in mainstream publications, they are willing to admit the earliest or youngest dates from a site because an archaeological site, because of the different levels, the mainstream, first of all, they dismiss the evidence, but if they ever even acknowledge it, like at Monteverde, they'll deal with the top level and not the lower levels. And so Professor Guidon did not come up with 22,000. Professor Guidon specifically and her team, they dated the page of Ferrata, so that the 48,000. So Professor Guidon, they dated the page of Ferrata site, which is in the Sierra de Capavera National Park. And so in the national park, Sierra de Capavera National Park, the page of Ferrata is 48,000 years ago. And that's before the charcoal at the hearth. The hearth, this dates it now to 56,000 years ago. So yes, it's the same site, but this article is mixing up. It looks like they're mixing up some of the dates, but it's definitely it's the oldest clearly documented site. And Professor Guidon was attacked simply because the dates blow away all the Bering Strait ideas and theories. Because it's interesting. The scholars and scientists in Europe don't have much problem with the date. The people who debate the dates are those in the Americas because they've built careers on it. And so they are willing to fight and destroy anybody's career who has any dates before this 13, 14, 15,000 year barrier. So there's many different sites, and Page of Ferrata is the one that gives them the most heartburn, and Monteverde gives them heartburn, and so does the other sites such as Puebla, Mexico. It gives them heartburn because there's no way that they can dismiss this other than by claiming. What can they claim? If somebody made a dating error? Wait a minute, these are professionals. What do you mean a dating error? Prove the dating error. They can't prove the dating error, so it's then to question the motives. Like they'll question the motives of Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre, who came up with the Huey, who dated the Huey Lactical site in Mexico, and that site is very, very old. And they question her motives and said, "Hey, we're not going to publish this unless you take a zero off." So I'm not changing my dates, but this is so. What it is that in this field, early American studies, it's people teach what's useful and not what's truthful, because they're defending and fighting to maintain their turf and their hegemony and dominance in the field. It's not scholarship, it's not science, it's political, is what it is.
Right.
And that's why they dismissed the Serra de Capivara National Park, where you have the Pedro Ferrada site, the paintings, human remains, there's artifacts. Oh, well, those must be geofacts created by nature. Really? This is an absolute artifact. This is coming up with stuff. It's the kind of intellectual gymnastics and somersaults that the dishonest people who represent the BS theory are
right. The Barren Strait theory. Right.
Yeah.
Now
they've destroyed a lot of careers by people who don't go along with it.
Now, once again, for those that don't know, the name of this article: "Discoveries Challenge Beliefs on Humans' Arrival in the Americas." This is from the New York Times, March 27, 2014, by Simon Romero. So, though that 22,000 years ago, 48,000 years ago, who were these humans? Were these the short-statured Africans, the Khoisan? Who were these people?
They wouldn't necessarily be Khoisan, but these were Africans, without a doubt. And this has been determined very clearly. So what I would share with people is a resource that I had mentioned. So if they don't read the work of Professor Guidon or the other archaeologists, then they should at least, and you can find it on YouTube, is Tracking the First Americans. And Tracking the First Americans. Yeah,
that's a documentary, right?
It's a documentary. It's only about an hour, because the first people who established the site in Brazil, they were attacked by a different racial group. You see battles through the rock art, and you see a different racial group, a different racial type, also found in the skeletal evidence as well. And so, but they may not, because people migrate that's a long migration. So what the people in Brazil would have come from, and what the argument and research shows, they would have migrated by watercraft from Melanesia or Australia. So they wouldn't have been Khoisan per se, but they would have been Africans. And in the early times, they were small stature, and they certainly would have come from that area by boat. And that's what the evidence leads us to at this point, that they were Africoid people who migrated in by watercraft.
I just want to go to one more section here of this article. Dr. Guidon remains defiant about her findings. Now, also, just so people know, in this article, there's a video interview with her from the New York Times as well. At her home on the grounds of a museum, she found it to focus on the discoveries in Serra de Capivara. She says she believed that humans had reached these plateaus even earlier, around 100,000 years ago, and might have come not overland from Asia, but by boat from Africa. Talk about that for a minute, please.
Well, I think it's important. So I have some articles, some of the, because an article like this, what we do is we look at where was the original publication and original studies published, because this is a summary of Guidon's work. So what I share with the students is some of the original writing, where she, because if a researcher is speculating about some dates, they know they're going to get attacked. Now, she didn't expect to get attacked, but she learned that that's what it was. So she moved away from speculation and going by the definitive dates. Even then, she was still attacked, but that's when it was clear that it was around these Africans about 48,000 years ago. So it's Professor Guidon's work, and the other person I was thinking of is Dr. Walter Neves. Dr. Walter Neves from Brazil is also his position and belief, because he's an anthropologist dealing with skeletal remains, that there would have been Africans traveling from Australia or Melanesia, Black peoples traveling from Australia or Melanesia, but they ultimately would have come from the African continent. And that's what his argument is. But from this quote from Guidon, I would like to see it more closely, but she clearly argues the same thing, that these are unmistakably Africans. And what happened to these original Africans is that they were attacked. they were attacked and they were largely wiped out by what they were calling Mongoloid. This is a term that they were using, right? So the people coming in through the Bering Strait came later, and they largely wiped out these original Africans who were in Brazil. But the fact that the Africans are in Brazil, this is pretty well established by the archaeological record. The fact that these were two separate groups, clearly different in appearance, fighting, this is also pretty well established by the evidence of fighting and the clear artwork. You can clearly see it for sure, that these are separate groups fighting. And so Neves and Guidon, these are different researchers, different research teams, but through their own individual angles have come to the same conclusion, that these are African migrants that were there first, going back 56,000 years ago. And Neves and Guidon both, and this is upsetting to the Bering Strait theorists, because
yes, it is.
They come by David Hopkins, because David Hopkins, when he wrote the Bering Strait Land Bridge, when he wrote his work in 1967 or so, that's when scholars started to then promote not just the Bering Strait theory, but the Bering Strait fact, that people came in through the north and that no one else could have been in the Americas, because in their mind, no one could have traveled other than by foot. They didn't have the ingenuity or the creativity to travel by watercraft, which is absurd. The waters have never been a barrier to travel. They've been a facilitator of travel. And it's people in the U.S. who mainly have problems with it. But people in South America, scholars in Europe, scientists in Europe, they don't have the same issue. But the Americans, they do, because it's political. Because, and one thing people should know, why would somebody fight facts? Or why wouldn't they, if they're the top of the class? That people have to buy their books. And when they turn those books into textbook, they're making
go ahead and keep talking for a minute. I'll be right back. Go ahead and
so they're making a lot of money with textbooks. They get a good salary, very nice lifestyle, and they give exclusive interviews, which helps to elevate their stock, elevate their status. And when they're at the top of their field, you would think that people would just be humble. Not at all. If someone comes up with a new discovery, they don't call to congratulate, they will attack. And this is what the standard is. If somebody doesn't know that, they're naive. This is exactly what happened. This is why Michael Cremo and his colleague wrote the book Forbidden Archaeology. Forbidden Archaeology. In other words, archaeological discoveries that have been attacked. So this is why Forbidden Archaeology is a very important resource, because Cremo is putting together archaeological discoveries in one book. And he uses the case of Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre at Huey Lactical, Mexico, to show that not only did the Bering Strait theorists, they like the Bering Strait Mafia, not only did they end Dr. McIntyre's career as a respected research at the U.S. Geological Survey. The last I checked, she was working at a nursing home as a gardener, but they don't allow anybody to challenge them. So that's why I call them the Bering Strait Mafia. They've ended a lot of careers because they're defending their turf just like a gang member or a thug would do. And you say, well, why would a scientist? Because it's about money, clout, and influence. That's why. And that's what we have in early American archaeology. This is why I spend time on it, to teach students research methods and introduce them to a lot of the original records and the evidence. And I say, you make your mind up. Here's the evidence from Neves and Guidon and all of the other scholars. What do you think? What do you think you're looking at? But it's so many different sites. There's no way to deny all of them. And that's exactly the first unit. That's actually the first unit in my U.S. history class, part 1. And we deal with the Bering Strait theory. And then by the time we finished the Bering Strait theory, meaning people migrated from the north, from Asia into North America, and became the first inhabitants of the Americas about 14 to 15,000 years ago. That's what the theory is. But by the time we learn the theory and look at the evidence against the theory, then students know why we refer to it accurately as not the Bering Strait, but the BS theory.
The BS theory. Okay. Now, I'm just curious. You're talking about different archaeologists. Are you familiar with Dr. Albert Goodyear at the University of South Carolina? Archaeologist at the University of South Carolina.
No, I don't think I am.
Okay, so I first found out about Dr. Albert Goodyear from my friend who's now an ancestor, Dr. David Imhotep. And Dr. David Imhotep wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. And actually, when the article from the New York Times that I just showed you, when it came out in 2014, I sent that to him as well, because he's been saying that the African presence in a lot of these areas is older than what we've been told. And he gave the example. He was the one that told me about 56,000 years ago in South America, in Brazil, specifically Brazil. So I just wanted to ask you about this. So there's an article, and the jury is probably still out on this discovery, but this dealt with this. Article came out. All the news outlets had stories on this. This particular one is from NBCnews.com. Mastodon bone findings could upend our understanding of human history. And this article is from, if people want to read it, April 26, 2017. But the main thing that I wanted to focus in on here is they mentioned Dr. Albert Goodyear, and I'm familiar with some of his work. But the article, going to your point, how archaeologists who put forth evidence that contradicts the status quo in archaeology, especially evidence that goes against the Clovis culture model or the Clovis model, they are attacked. This article says, and the archaeology mainstream is very unforgiving of researchers who challenge the accepted dates, said Albert Goodyear Dr. Albert Goodyear of the University of South Carolina, who's been working to prove for years, FOR, for years, that stone tools found in a South Carolina site date to as long as 50,000 years ago. Now, Dr. Albert Goodyear is a white man, just so people know. He said, quote, there is a lot of ignorance and arrogance about just how little we know about the Western Hemisphere. And so he was not involved in this discovery in San Diego dealing with the mastodon skeletons. He said, these things are very controversial. Okay, very controversial. But he did say the discovery in San Diego is compelling. And let me see. Now, okay, so just go ahead and comment on that. And the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because the discovery that he made in Allendale County, South Carolina in 2004, he and his team said they found 13 different types of evidence documenting a presence of humans here in this land. So it'd be the South Carolina, Georgia area. Going back, he said it dates back at least 51,700 years ago. Okay, but just talk about what he's saying when archaeologists present evidence that contradicts mainstream archaeology, how they get attacked. Can you hear me?
Thank you. It's kind of in and out, but yeah. So I think to talk about that's a one of a number of episodes where people have been attacked because they challenge the Bering Strait Mafia. And the Bering Strait Mafia, they're very fierce. They're fighting for turf. It's not about evidence. It's about ideology and maintaining their turf and their financial status. Because like when people have textbooks, they make a lot of money, and students are the victims of it. That's why there's a movement for zero textbook costs, or ZTC. Wow. And so that's big. And so like on our website, for example, for our classes at Contra Costa College, there's a symbol now, whether or not you have a zero textbook costs, because that's the position now to protect students from this high pricing of textbook. But that's part of the revenue stream. plus doing exclusive interviews for the History Channel or National Geographic.
Yes.
That's another revenue stream. Plus they get grants and fellowships. That's another revenue stream. So when newer scholars come about and they find something that directly contradicts the dates and details presented earlier, then what we're asking these folks to do is to be honest.
Right.
And potentially give up a very nice lifestyle, and they're not willing to do it. So this is why they usually close ranks and they attack. And you know, when you walked away, you might have heard it, but this is why Michael Cremer wrote the book Forbidden Archaeology, because there's a lot of these examples where not only is the archaeological evidence challenged, but the people and their credibility is challenged. So I use Dr. Virginia Steve McIntyre. She had nothing to gain by making something up. She's a credible scientist, asked to come in, date the site, and then was attacked and her career destroyed. But there's a number of examples like that, because the barrier is this: anything older than 14 to 15,000 years ago upturns the theory.
Yes.
And so the theory no longer makes sense. So yes, we know that people migrated in from the north, but the part of the theory that doesn't make sense is that this is not the first time people came into the Americas. That's the part that breaks down. Yes, we know they migrated in, but there were people already in the Americas. So that example that you're referring to from South Carolina is one of many, many examples throughout North America, Central America, South America, that flat out and directly contradicts this position. You know, like the footprints at Puebla, Mexico.
Right.
And these are documented by credible sources. This was like a Discovery Channel on their site. I found this this was 2003. I think it's 2003. So it's been 2 decades. And Page and Ferrata, 1986. Monteverdi, Chile, this was 1998, reported in the New York Times. You know, so even in mainstream press. So this is what happens. People promote dates. There's a skull in Delmar. Once people promote dates, they're going to get attacked. So the question is, do you stand by your evidence? Most times people adjust. They lower the dates to make it closer to the 13, 14, 15,000-year-old Clovis barrier, so that they can keep their career. That's what most of them do. It's a career move. It's not about evidence. It's about saving my behind so I can keep a job type of position. That's what they do. McIntyre didn't do that. She stood on the evidence, and people around her ran away because they didn't want to have their careers destroyed. So there's so many examples, and people are not willing to give it up because they're defending their turf like a vicious gang member would do. But they're operating in the academic arena, and that's what makes it more troubling, because without thought, people think, oh, yeah, well, scientists are honest. No, the scientists are the ones who are the leading distorters of historical evidence and data. That's what they're about, including Samuel Morton and the rest of these folks who are creating wild ideas about human remains. So that example, brother, is one of a number of them that should be known about.
Right. I just want to give this source here, and then we're going to wrap up with your book, and you can tell people again how to get your book. So this was an article. I learned about Dr. Albert Goodyear from Dr. David Imhotep. Everybody can go read this article. This is from ScienceDaily.com, and there were other articles when this came out. This article came out November 18th, 2004. Called New Evidence Puts Man in North America 50,000 Years Ago. Here's a picture of Dr. Albert Goodyear. Like I said, he's a white man. And this if this is true, this puts an African presence in North America 50,000 years ago. But this is the discovery that he and his team made in South Carolina. And he has been attacked. And I quoted him in that article from 2017. He has been attacked, and they're trying to, the establishment archaeologists are trying to disprove his discovery. And the reason why is, if they have to admit that there were people here before the Clovis culture in New Mexico, people are going to find out that these were African people. If you have evidence that the first people in this land that we call the United States of America, or what some Native Americans call Turtle Island, were African people, game over. Because the consciousness of African people will be transformed overnight. because we're largely taught that we first came to this land conquered by Europeans, shackled and chained. Okay, when we learn that this was our land stolen from us, you're going to have a seismic shift in the consciousness, and the establishment archaeologists and white supremacy in general can't let that happen. Go ahead and wrap up with your book.
Yeah, well, you know, the thing I would add from a research methods point of view is that to all of the articles, it's incumbent for the primary researcher to go to the original study, because when the articles come out, that alerts the public about a new discovery. But all of the articles that come out, they'll indicate the research team, who led the team, and what institution they're affiliated with, as well as where the original study is published. Right. So that's where it really is important to go to the original study and then examine the evidence, because that's where the attacks take place. Not necessarily the newspaper or journal article that comes up, a newspaper article, but the actual study, and does the evidence prove what it is
attacking the study. Attacking the study, right?
Yes. So the study has to be examined, and when the study is examined, either it holds up or it doesn't hold up. But the articles are important because they alert us to the study that's come out in a professional journal, and then we examine the evidence. And honestly, sometimes they hold up, sometimes they don't. But the bottom line is, the mainstream, their position is none of it's going to hold up because it would upset and overturn their position. So they're attacking the study because it is outside of the boundaries and the historical time frame that they've already presented. So you know what it is? It's like this, is that when you're looking at early American settlements, or when American, I don't mean the U.S., but the early settlements in the Americas, it's like a puzzle. And when you're finding pieces here and there, you get an idea of what you have. And people are familiar with a jigsaw puzzle. You don't need to have every piece to understand the puzzle. So what happens is that when these people, the mainstream, the BS theorists, they want people to think that there's a shorter time period and people came from Asia first. But that's not what the evidence says. That's not correct at all. People were here much longer than that. So they're looking for anything that fits their theory. So when someone comes up with evidence far older than what is being claimed, then instead of saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we have the whole jigsaw puzzle as configured wrong, because this piece does not fit in at all. So rather than saying, well, let's reconsider the layout of the puzzle because this is clearly a piece of the puzzle and it doesn't fit, they don't do that. They throw out the piece and try to find something to fit the fake and phony puzzle that they put together in the first place. It's an a priori assumption. It's a prior assumption that doesn't fit the evidence, and that's what we deal with. So that's why it's really incumbent of going directly to the study to see, because there's been some claims that have been challenged, and probably rightfully so, but there's a whole body of them that are absolutely credible, that cannot be overturned, that can't be credibly challenged, but the Bering Strait theorists somehow do challenge it, and so that they can reach the conclusion that they know better, and therefore let me keep my prominent lifestyle and my prominent name out there because we got there first and we know better than anybody else, and that's pretty much what happens. So it's always amazing. And this is what I really train people in terms of the research methods, is that we go directly to the source, we examine the evidence, because if you're doing primary research, you're doing original research, but you do have to rely on the work of others, but there has to be a critical assessment of it. And by the way, in the world of archaeology or early African studies or early American studies, if somebody's claiming a discovery, and this is what I share in my book, the whole first section of the book is about research methods. In the introduction, it's got to be two things that have to be established. If someone claims that they made a discovery, it's two things, and I have this laid out methodically in the book. Number one, you have to show in situ photographs. In situ photographs means they're photographs in the situation in which you claim to have found the artifact or the human remains. So you can't just take a artifact, for example, and say is old, and then you clean it up and then you put it against a wall for a nice background and claim and tell us that this came from this site. We don't know that. We weren't there. That's not good enough. You can't clean it up and then dust off all of the dirt and put it up. We want to see the photographs of which you claim to found it in that situation. It's called in situ photograph, a series of them. And also there has to be a detailed written report as well to explain all these details. And now with photography and video, that's another requirement. And without that, we don't trust what anybody is claiming as some major discovery because we don't know. We weren't there. So this is the standards in the scientific community. And so people will either present this in a scholarly journal, their findings, or they will present it at a professional gathering of experts in that particular field. Those are the two ways. Either you have it at a professional annual gathering, or you present it in a refereed or a scholarly journal. And then we make our assessment and our examination of the credibility of the evidence. And usually there's an a priori assumption that it ain't credible because it's older than what we've ever discovered. As a matter of fact, you know what they told Professor Guidon? You could not have discovered it because we didn't discover it. What kind of position is that?
Yeah, it's a white supremacist position. That's what we're dealing with. All right, let's go ahead and tell people once again the name of your book and how they can get it.
Okay, I appreciate that. So my book is a history of African civilizations, and it grew out of my work at Contra Costa College. It's a small part of what I teach there, but it's a second revised edition. It's only $29.95. It's some of my field research in various countries over the last 3 decades, and it moves through the survey of the civilizations on the African continent, and also a little focus on the influence of the Moors in Spain, as well as the African original presence and influence in the Americas before slavery, before Columbus, even before Christ. So the main thing is to really put African civilizations on the map and to talk about Africa without having to deal with slavery and colonialism and when Africa was derailed. The book is not focusing on that. That's a whole other story. We're focusing on Africa at the apex of human achievement, and so that's my book. So, and it's also useful in the classroom or in the homeschool. If people are teaching at home or just want to learn at home and build your library, the book is useful in all of those scenarios.
His website is advancingtheresearch.org, advancingtheresearch.org. Get Professor Manu Ampim's latest book, A History of African Civilizations. This is the second revised edition. Also, Brother Haki had the question, do you have any tours coming up?
I do, and thanks for the question. So this summer, I'm going to take two groups. It'll be a tour to Kemet, or Egypt, from June 8th through the 22nd, 15 days. And then after that, I'm leading an educational tour to Ethiopia, or the land of Kush, from June 25th through July 10th. That's 16 days. And just so people are aware that for the tours that I lead, I take people to 25% more sites and monuments than any other tour. It doesn't mean the other tours don't have value, but we go to 25% more locations. So the tours, you can reach me, probably the easiest way is through Facebook, YouTube, or just at Manu Ampim at Gmail. Manu Ampim at Gmail. And then you can learn about the tours because the deadlines are coming up in April. So there's still room for both Kemet and Ethiopia, but the deadlines are coming up. Kemet and then Ethiopia.
Can people contact you through your website, advancingtheresearch.org?
Yes, they can. Yeah, they can contact.
Click on contact and click on contact us. Contact
us and
at the top of the page.
At top of the page. They can just email at info at advancingtheresearch.org as well. Okay. And we have one other. Next weekend we'll have one other last session about the educational tours to Kemet and Ethiopia. And I'm excited because we're going to bring a great group this summer, And then after the tours, I'm going to continue my work in the Omo Valley in South Sudan this summer. But please join us, folks. And I'll say one thing. Sometimes people say, well, sometimes they'll say, well, do you go every year? No such thing as every year, because you never know. Like, for example, COVID disrupted travel, and so did the Egyptian revolution, or what they call the Arab Spring in 2011. It disrupted. So twice in a decade, you had situations where no one can travel to the area. So you never really know. But we're going this year. So check it out and come learn. Come learn, have a good time. So I appreciate it, brother. I mean, this is
no problem.
History, African History Network. That's what.
Yes. That's what we do.
That's what we do.
All right, brother. Well, look, you have a good day, Professor Manu Ampim. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on today. Everybody stay on for one more minute. Got a special message for you. So we'll talk to you soon, okay, brother? And buy his book, please, and go on his tour. All right, brother. Peace.
Michael. Okay, brother.
All right.
Peace.
Hotel. Peace.
Hotel. Peace.
All right, everybody. That is Professor Manu Ampim. Be sure to follow us here on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, Imhotep. Follow us on our social media platforms as well, on Twitter and Instagram. We have the information here on the homepage of our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. You can also register for the 10-week online history course that I teach, where we deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. This is a class that I created the curriculum. I've been teaching it since 2017, on and off. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. So the class is discounted to $60. We're going to do about 12 class sessions, including the first session, which was the overview. We have the class lesson plan here for all 10 or 11 class sessions as well. So you can see the type of content that we cover. You can download the class lesson plans here as well. So we deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. We look at some ancient African civilizations, not just ancient Kemet, but also Kush, Ethiopia. We look at Great Zimbabwe. We look at Hannibal Barca and Carthage. We talk about the African Moors as well. We have a preview of the class here also. So you can register for it. Click right here to register for the class. We do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded, so you can go back and watch it anytime. So a year from now, 2 years from now, you have full access. You can go back and watch the entire course, okay? Our next classes are Saturday, April 6th, Saturday, April 13th, April 20th, April 27th, 2024. And we do the classes usually 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We may have one last class session after April 27th. We have to see how much we can cover, okay? But as soon as you register, you can start watching the content. And we're going to post the link right here, so you can start watching it right now as soon as you register for the class. The content is PG-13, so you can use this with your children. There are 80 to 100 articles that we reference in the class. There's like 15 books. You don't have to buy any books to follow along in class. And we talk about this here in the lesson plan. Okay, we can't start studying our history and slavery even when we study the transatlantic slave trade, which is important. We can't start in 1619 or the 1440s when the Portuguese get involved. We have to deal with hundreds of years, deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors. Also deal with some of the history of the Khoisan, who go all around the world. There are 200 slides, over 200 slides that I put together in our PowerPoint presentation that we'll look at. There are 80 to 100 articles that we'll reference. So I picked out the articles. There are 15 books that we reference. So we show you excerpts of the book on the screen. You don't have to buy any of the books if you don't want to. They're good for your library if you want to. Also, we'll look at excerpts of interviews that I've done with some of our scholars, like Professor James Small, Professor Kabahai Kamene, Anthony Browder, Tony Browder, who wrote Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization and Egypt on the Potomac. We use those two books. Those are two of the books we use in the class. Also, we'll look at excerpts of interviews that I've done with Runoko Rashidi and some other scholars also. Okay, so we do the sessions live. All the sessions are recorded. You can go back and watch it anytime. All right. That's Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. If you want to support the African History Network, another way you can do so through, now this is the show I did deconstructing Candace Owens, the lies she was telling on the Breakfast Club. This is part 1 of the fact check. This was 2.5 hours, and we got into some deep history. I provided sources, dispelling a lot of the nonsense she was talking about. Part 2, we're going to do that on Sunday, April 7th. It'll be 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on the African History Network show, because we're going to get into the lies that she was talking, saying that Donald Trump would be better for America. Donald Trump is better for Black people, things like this. We can go through and point by point dispel all that nonsense she was talking about. Listen to the African History Network show Sundays, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Facebook and YouTube. We're listen to the podcast also. It's a podcast from, search for the African History Network show, or click right here, the link for podcast. Then we have our Cash App and PayPal information here. $ the AHN show through Cash App, $ the AHN show through Cash App, also through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN show. This helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, pay some of the bills, finance the research, finance the broadcast, etc. Pay for these services that I have to use to do these broadcasts and run the African History Network. This is our official Cash App account, $ the AHN show, SHOW. When you go to say Michael, these other ones here, and it's like 5 fake African History Network Cash App accounts I've identified that they're stealing money from us. You can click here on our link. It shows our QR code. So this is our Cash App account, and we have the link here for PayPal as well. Okay. And lastly, we have a bundle pack where you get 15 of my lectures in digital download format. That is African History Awakens the African Mind from Mental Death. African History Awakens the African Mind from Mental Death. We have it in digital download format, so you can download the videos and keep them. This is at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. This is on sale, half off is on sale, $75. It's 15 of my lectures, including my lectures dealing with the film Black Panther and dealing with the African cultural influences in Black Panther and how the film Black Panther relates to African history, culture, language, spiritual systems. We have lectures dealing with that I've done dealing with Malcolm X, the distortion of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., six principles of political self-defense, because I'm also a national political commentator. A lot of people see me every Friday on Roland Martin Unfiltered. I've been on Roland's show pretty much every Friday since October 2020. So I'm not just a historian. I'm a national political commentator, radio show host, lecturer, etc., researcher. I taught entrepreneurship for 7 years. My degree's in business administration from Wayne State University. So there's a lecture that I did, 13 Forms of Wealth, Keys to Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment. Ancient Kemet, the Winter Solstice and the History of Christmas. This is a double lecture that I did with Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. So we did this double lecture here in Detroit a few years ago. Redistributing the Pain, How African Americans Fought Back with Economic Boycotts. The Light of Ancient Egypt Awakens the African Mind to Economic Empowerment. Ancient Africans in America Before Native Americans, Columbus, or Slavery. Great African Women in History, the Mothers of Civilization. That's a 4-hour lecture that I did. Great African History, the Mothers of Civilization. And then we have a Black Panther analysis for children. I was speaking to about 60 African-American children and their teachers. These were 5th through 12th graders. Okay. We did this here at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African-American History. Then also African-American resistance in the era of Donald Trump, voter suppression, reparations, and how elections have consequences. Okay. So, and then you'll get the presentation I did dealing with Black Panther Wakanda Forever. I did that in November 2022. So you actually get 16 lectures. Okay. So African-American History Awakens the African Mind from mental death. That's a bundle pack. If you want it on DVD, it's $100 if you want that bundle pack in DVD format. All right. Okay. So we're going to get out of here. Remember at the, let me post this here. So we have the Cash App, PayPal information also. Hopefully you learned a lot today. Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. You can go back and rewatch this as well, and watch the show that I did with Candace Owens. Also, we have the broadcast that I did dealing with the history of Easter, Easter origins, pagan traditions, and then African Americans and the Exodus. You can watch that also. That's streaming on our social media platforms as well, Facebook and YouTube. Okay. We have the Cash App, PayPal information here. Remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating and empowering and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it's correct wrong behaviors, not over till we win, Wakanda forever.